In the winter of 1848, in a small wooden farmhouse in upstate New York, two sisters, aged 14 and 11, decided to play a trick on their mother. They would sit in the dark, holding hands under the bed covers, and ask an invisible spirit questions, and in answer, a series of sharp, ghostly raps would sound through the room, knock, 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 seeming to come from nowhere, and no one. Their mother was terrified. She was also completely convinced. And within a matter of months, that small, private joke between two bored little girls would ignite a religious movement that swept across the United States and Europe, drew in millions of genuine believers, shaped how an entire generation grieved its dead, and would not be exposed, by the sisters' own confession, for another 40 years. This is the story of Kate and Margaret Fox, the girls who convinced the world they could speak to the dead, using nothing but the joints in their own toes. The Fox family lived in Hydesville, a tiny community in rural New York, in a rented farmhouse with a reputation. Neighbors already whispered that the house was haunted, unsettled by strange sounds no one could quite explain. Into that atmosphere of quiet unease came two young sisters with time on their hands, vivid imaginations, and, as it would turn out, an unusual physical talent. Kate, the younger, was about 11. Margaret, or Maggie, was closer to 14. Both girls had discovered, quite by accident, that they could crack the joints of their toes and produce a sound remarkably like a knock on a solid door, sharp, percussive, and crucially, almost impossible to trace to its actual source if you weren't looking directly at their feet. On the night of March 31st, 1848, the girls decided to have some fun with it. They snapped their toe joints in the darkness of their shared bedroom and told their mother that a spirit was communicating with them. Ask it a question, they said. So their mother did, nervously asking the invisible presence to rap out her children's ages one by one. The knocks came back, one at a time, matching each child's age perfectly. Their mother, thoroughly frightened, called in neighbors to witness this astonishing phenomenon for themselves, and the neighbors heard it too. Rap, rap, rap. A dead man, the girls claimed, communicating through a kind of primitive code. One knock for yes, silence for no, patterns for letters and numbers. He told them, through the raps, that he had been murdered and buried in the cellar of the very house they were sitting in. What had started as two sisters trying to spook their mother for an evening had, within days, become the talk of the entire county. Curious and increasingly frightened neighbors began digging in the cellar the girls had named, searching for the murdered man's remains. They found, according to later accounts, some scattered bones and bits of what might have been a decomposed body, though nothing was ever definitively identified, and no missing person was ever conclusively tied to the house. It did not matter. The half answer was, if anything, more powerful than a clean one would have been. A community already primed to believe now had a shallow grave and a scattering of bones to point to, and the story only grew from there. Here is where the story could have ended, quietly, the way most childhood pranks do, a scolding, a confession, an early night. Instead, something else happened. The adults around Kate and Margaret Fox looked at what these girls could do, and rather than dismissing it, they organized around it. Their older sister, Leah, already an adult living apart from the family, saw something in her younger sister's trick that went far beyond a spooky story for the neighbors. America in 1848 was a nation aching for exactly what the Fox sisters seemed to offer. Infant and childhood death were tragically common. Entire families had loved ones lost to disease, accident, and war, with no way to say a final word or hear one back. Formal religion offered comfort, certainly, but it offered no conversation, no way to actually reach across the divide and ask the people you'd lost whether they were all right, whether they forgave you, whether they were waiting. Leah recognized, whether cynically or sincerely history still debates, that her sisters had accidentally built a bridge that an entire grieving nation was desperate to cross, and so she became their manager. It is worth pausing here on Leah herself, because she is arguably the most important architect of what the Fox sisters became. The most overlooked figures in the entire story. Kate and Margaret were children. They had stumbled onto a trick, not a business plan. It was Leah, an adult with financial pressures of her own, who understood that raw belief needed structure, ticketing, and a stage to become something sustainable. Without her, the Hydesville wrappings very plausibly stay exactly what they started as, a strange, local ghost story that fades within a season. With her, they became the seed of an international religious movement. She began organizing paid demonstrations. She coached the girls on how to hold a séance, how to build suspense in a darkened room, how to let the anticipation of the audience do half the work before a single knock ever sounded. Word spread beyond Hydesville, beyond the county, beyond the state. By 1850, the Fox sisters were touring, performing their spirit communications for paying crowds in some of the largest cities in America, including a sold-out demonstration at one of New York City's most respected hotels. What the Fox sisters had unintentionally founded was an entire religious movement, and it came to be known as spiritualism, the belief that the spirits of the dead could and did communicate with the living, typically through certain gifted individuals called mediums. And spiritualism did not stay a curiosity confined to a farmhouse in New York. It exploded. Within a decade, historians estimate that spiritualism claimed literally millions of adherents across the United States and Europe. Seances became a genuine social institution, held in parlors from modest homes to the residences of the wealthy and powerful. New mediums sprang up everywhere, each claiming their own methods of contacting the departed, some using raps just like the Fox sisters, others claiming to channel spirit voices, produce ghostly writing, or summon physical manifestations in darkened rooms. The movement attracted believers from every level of society, including, according to persistent historical accounts, figures as prominent as First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, who reportedly held seances in the White House itself, grieving for a young son lost to illness. An entire economy grew up around the movement. Mediums charged for private sittings, published pamphlets and newspapers devoted to spiritualist teachings, and spiritualist churches were founded that, remarkably, still exist in some form to this day. All of it, this vast religious and cultural phenomenon touching millions of lives, traced back to two young sisters and the simple discovery that a cracked toe joint sounds uncannily like a knock from beyond the grave. And spiritualism carried a genuinely progressive undercurrent that is easy to miss looking back at it purely as a hoax. Many mediums of the era were women, at a time when women had few public platforms of any kind to speak, lead, or be listened to with any real authority. As a spirit medium, a woman could stand in front of a mixed audience and be heard, believed, even revered, which meant, whatever the truth behind the Fox sisters' raps, the movement they sparked genuinely offered other women a kind of public voice and independence that respectable 19th century society rarely extended to them anywhere else. For the Fox sisters personally, however, fame did not translate into anything resembling a happy life. They were investigated repeatedly throughout their careers. Skeptics and scientific committees attempted again and again to catch them cheating, and while some investigators walked away professing themselves baffled, others grew deeply suspicious of exactly how the sounds were produced, noting that they seemed to occur only when the sisters' feet or legs were not being carefully watched. The pressure of decades spent performing, of being simultaneously worshipped as prophets and hunted as frauds, wore on both women terribly. Both Kate and Margaret struggled for years with alcoholism, and their once close relationship with their sister and manager, Leah, curdled into bitter estrangement as money and control over the family's spiritual business drove them apart. There is something quietly tragic buried in this part of the story that rarely makes it into the shorter retellings. Kate and Margaret Fox never grew up in any ordinary sense. From the ages of 11 and 14, their entire identities, their income, and their families' fortunes were built around sustaining a performance they had first put on as a childish joke. They were not permitted to simply outgrow it, the way most children outgrow a prank. The lie had become the family business, and by the time either sister was old enough to fully understand what they had built, walking away from it was no longer a simple option available to them. And then, in 1888, 4 decades after that first night in Hydesville, Margaret Fox did something that stunned the movement she had helped create. She confessed. Standing on the stage of the New York Academy of Music, in front of a paying audience assembled specifically for the occasion, Margaret Fox announced that spiritualism was, in her own words, a fraud from beginning to end, and then, to prove it beyond any possible doubt, she removed her shoe, placed her bare foot on a wooden stool positioned on the stage, and cracked her toe joint for the entire room to hear. The sound was unmistakable. It was the exact same sharp rap that had convinced millions of people for 40 years that they were hearing messages from beyond the grave. Her sister Kate stood beside her that night and reportedly confirmed the confession, adding her own agreement that the entire phenomenon had been an elaborate trick sustained across their childhood and long into their adult lives. Margaret went further still, publishing a detailed written confession, describing precisely how she and Kate had trained themselves as young girls, practicing for hours to snap their toe joints louder and more controllably, developing what amounted to a physical skill in service of a lie neither of them had ever meant to grow so large. And yet, and this is the strange, almost unbelievable coda to the entire story, the confession did not kill spiritualism, not even close. True believers within the movement rejected the confession outright, some insisting Margaret Fox had been paid to discredit her own gift by hostile skeptics, others simply choosing to believe what they had always believed, regardless of what evidence now stood in front of them. Even more remarkably, within about a year, Margaret Fox herself publicly recanted her own confession, once again insisting that her mediumship abilities were genuine after all, though by then, deep in poverty and struggling with addiction, few observers were certain which version of Margaret Fox to believe, or whether she herself entirely knew. Both sisters died within a few years of that stage confession, Kate in 1892 and Margaret in 1893, both in poverty, both largely estranged from the movement that had once made them internationally famous. Spiritualism itself limped on for decades afterward in various forms, gradually fading as its original mediums died off and public fascination moved elsewhere. Though isolated spiritualist congregations persist to this day, still holding services rooted in a belief system founded, quite literally, on the cracking of a child's toe joint in a rented farmhouse. The story of the Fox sisters lands differently than the other deceivers on this channel, and it's worth sitting with why. Victor Lustig sold a tower he never owned. Gregor McGregor invented an entire nation. But Kate and Margaret Fox never set out to build a religion. Two bored, unsupervised children played a single prank on a frightened mother, and the adults around them, driven by grief, ambition, and a desperate hunger for comfort, built an empire on top of it that outgrew the two little girls who started it entirely. Perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson in this particular story. Sometimes the most enormous deceptions in history were never even planned by the people who get blamed for them. Sometimes the world simply needs a lie badly enough to build the rest of it all by itself. If you enjoyed this story, you know what this channel is about. The con, the cult, and the collapse. History's greatest deceivers, and the moment it all came crashing down. Subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.